Megan, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Great.
Hey. Yep. Okay, so this is quite a long story. When I was 15, Ewan presented me with a 25-page autobiography that he wrote for me when he was in England in 1986. At the time, I remember being so honoured that he did this. I still have these pages and I reread them just a couple of weeks ago. I will cherish these pages for as long as I live, and much of what I say today is taken from this story. There is so much more detail to the different parts of Ewan's life that I can't go into, but I'll name drop the people who I know were there, and they'll be able to fill you in later. So Ewan starts the story by saying, part of the reason I'm writing this is that I want you to understand that the reason all of us do the things we do is that we are all trying to give some reason, some meaning to our lives. There is, I believe, a living at peace with this mystery, an awareness of change, a way of spending your life doing things that give meaning to you. For no one sees meaning in the same things, and we each have to find that medium of fulfillment. The first instrument Ewan learnt was the bagpipes. He did, however, talk about loving the family sing-alongs as a child and wanting to play the piano like his sister Glenys. Ewan's father, Harry, was an Australian champion piper, but it was his grandfather, Alec, from whom he learnt. He played for a couple of years as a child until he was good enough to play in the band, but quit to spend more time on one of his other great passions, cricket. But it was in 1966 when Harry brought home an LP called Beatles for Sale that sparked his passion for music and guitar. He says, "It made me want to play music, not just listen to it." A couple of years later, he purchased his first guitar for $13 from money he saved from his paper run. He says of the guitar, "It had an almost unplayable action, a badly made bridge, a useless set of machine heads, and the sound was even worse. But it ruined my academic career and calluses grew where the blood had flowed." He finished senior with not ideal results, but nonetheless attempted to follow the law career his father had planned for him, studying at UQ and doing his articles at a firm in the city. But he was determined to pursue music. He says, "There was the music, there was the job and the future career my father had for me, and there was my insistence on going my own way." He formed his first band with some local guys, and inspired by Dylan, Ewan, along with his friend David Radcliffe, started to write songs. I believe Robbie Stewart knew him around this time, but he may have to confirm that. By this stage, Ewan had already met his first wife, Heather. He had worked for a couple of months at his father's real estate and shared a ride home with a young typist who also lived in Bulimba. He asked her out. He writes, "She was intense, bright, cheerful and moody, and over the course of a few months we became constant companions." He failed his law exams, walked into the partner's office at the law firm and left the pieces of his articles like confetti on the carpet. He says, "I was deadly serious about the music." So the adventure begins. Restlessness, a somewhat common theme throughout this story, sets in and Ewan heads off to Sydney. Until this move, he'd never been beyond the limits of southeast Queensland. And up until this time in Sydney, Ewan was absolutely against alcohol. In Sydney, he had his first drink, Bacardi and Coke. Ewan was a pretty straight and naive young man. He was actually a Sunday school teacher, if you can believe it. There is a story of him smashing some guy's beer bottles on a picnic because he was so opposed to alcohol. Ewan landed a job as a guitarist in a band called Click. They had a top 10 hit in New South Wales at the time and a 5-night-a-week residency at a hotel in Coolangatta booked. The resident band before Click was Sherbet. This was a really wild time, from what I can gather, when he was exposed to the seedier sides of life, really for the first time. The band worked 2 gigs a night, played Coolangatta until 11, packed up, drove to Surfers Paradise, set up and played until 4 a.m. He says, "It was an intense time where I got more involved in sex, drugs and rock and roll than I had ever before." Click won the local talent final and toured Queensland with Daddy Cool. Robin Walsh was the drummer, I believe, in that band. He's around. Yep, there he is. And the band broke up and Ewan headed back to Sydney with Heather. Heather worked as a legal secretary and Ewan worked in a day job in an insurance company while playing gigs in clubs and bars with Col Noble, who is also here. And Heather and Ewan lived for a while with him in Mossman. It was during this time that Heather and Ewan got married at the registry office in Watson Square on the 25th of February 1972. Ewan was 20 and Heather was 18. Restlessness sets in again and he moves back to Brisbane. He plays in bands Shuffle and Preston while working for the government. His band supports Santana at Festival Hall. There is a lot of partying with Heather and Ewan's childhood sweetheart Linda. But that restlessness is back again and in a really big way, and he heads off to California. The year is 1974 and Ewan arrives in San Diego. He buys a Gibson 175, goes to LA to stay with a Hollywood set designer friend of a friend who lives off Sunset Boulevard. Goes to Hollywood parties, meets Jeff Bridges. He then spends time in San Francisco, Telegraph Avenue, where he meets musicians and plays in bars and coffee houses. He swapped the Gibson 175 for the Gibson Heritage, the guitar that he wrote a number of his early albums on. And this is the guitar that he played for most of my childhood. And I'm so fortunate to still have this guitar. Whenever I look at it, I see him. In San Francisco, Ewan met a bass player called Bruce who worked in a guitar shop. And one day Ewan was sitting in the shop playing and in walked Carlos Santana. This is a classic story. I've heard this my whole life. And in Ewan's words, Bruce knew him. He had played bass for him years ago and he introduced me. Carlos sat down, picked up a guitar and started playing. I stopped. What do you do? I've never been the outgoing, confident type. I just grinned at him and put my guitar down. It was good enough just to sit there and watch him play. The intention was to keep travelling the world, but he headed back to Australia and moved into a share house in Ashgrove. I actually lived in a house opposite this house on Waterworks Road. He says that the house was somewhat of the social centre of the Brisbane gay scene at the time, great parties with people in theatre and classical music. This period, when he returns from California, from what I can gather, seems to be when he really starts to formulate his own drive and direction in music. He had written a lot of material while he was away and reforms Angel with a different lineup. Steve Tebbett, who I believe is here today, and others, Ed, Bruce and Roger. He says he put more into this band than he ever had before. They played original material and he describes it as similar to Pink Floyd. He played a Flying V guitar that was made especially for him by Chris Kinman and it was called Angel. He bought a PA for the first time. In 1975, Ewan started an acoustic music club in Paddington. It was here that he met Alan Mackey, who is here, and Tony McHenry. He played in a band called Shuffle, which toured with Normie Rowe, and he also met Trevor Knight, with whom he toured New South Wales. Again in Brisbane, and Ewan goes to see Tony McHenry's new band, Moose Malone, with Jerry Allen, who is here, and Jim Brailsford and Bruce. By the end of the night, he's in the band. He says, I had a cowboy hat, boots, vest, scarf, and was playing things from the Eagles to country swing. The band had a residency at the Stock Exchange Hotel in the city. And this is where he met my mother, his second wife, Judy, along with the Simpsons and the Hillis Gang. In January 1977, Moose Malone went to Tamworth and won Best Group, and Ewan won Best Instrumentalist. He says, this country music can't be all bad, I thought. We came home minor heroes and played to packed rooms all over Brisbane. Moose Malone toured Queensland, signed to RCA, but Ewan left the band just before they went to Sydney to record. He questioned this decision, and he says, I should have gone with them, perhaps. He seems to be a little lost for a while after this period, ends up moving up to the Sunshine Coast, a place that he'd already fallen in love with by this time. He lived on South Coolum Road, and Judy and friends came up to visit regularly. Trevor Knight gets in touch with him to record an album with RCA at Albert Studios in King Street, so he heads back to Sydney. Judy comes to live with him in March 1978, and they move to Mona Vale. And this is where Ewan tells me I was conceived. I remember being a bit uncomfortable with this when I read it at 15, but not at all surprised. Ewan was very open with that sort of thing, and often shared the kind of information you may not want to hear from a father. But I suppose I did the same to him. We're almost best friends rather than father-daughter. Anyway, they find out they're expecting me and pack the old Kingswood, I remember this car, and drive to Coolum. Ewan plays in a band Banshee with Barry Charles, Andy Tainch, Rick Lloyd and Ken Stevenson, with a regular gig at Surf Air. They are living back on South Coolum Road, and I am born in April 79. Judy was studying nursing at Nambour Hospital, so Ewan and I spent a great deal of time together in my early years. Down on the beach at the bays in Coolum, exploring the rock pools. We lived in various places in Coolum and then Peregian. Kim Beckman and Karen were good friends. Later, Ewan started playing gigs in a duo with Steve Tebbett in Brisbane, and they were doing really well. Ewan won Best Guitarist at the Queensland Rock Awards in 1981, and they did TV shows, one of which was The Talent Quest in Sydney. I'm sure Steve can tell you more about that. They toured Northern Territory and Queensland with Doug Ashdown in 82. After the duo with Steve Tebbett, Ewan started a band with Tony McHenry, the MacKenzie McHenry Band, and Ewan and I moved to Brisbane while Judy continued nursing. The next band was The Last Resort, Barry Charles's band, touring North Queensland, Mackay, Bowen, Airlie Beach. He then started the duo with Mick Thatcher and Ewan. And Ewan, Judy and I moved into this big old Queenslander in Stafford Street in East Brisbane. My bedroom was moved onto the veranda sleep out to make way for Ewan's home recording studio. And in 1985, he put out his first solo album, Port of Call, in 1985, and received some interest from a recording company in London, so he left for the UK in the beginning of 1986. The pages that Ewan wrote for me end here in the UK. He played in a few bands over there. I can only recall a man called Francis Licorice. My mother and I went over to the UK in late 86 and we travelled through Europe as a family, which was a wonderful experience. Ewan's mother, my grandmother Joy, was unwell with cancer, so we came back to Brisbane. Much of the 80s, I remember Ewan working a lot. He had a duo with Mick Thatcher, and they had regular gigs at the Hard Rock Cafe during Expo 88. My parents bought a house in Norman Park, and it was around this time that Ewan was in a band with Brian Devereaux called Looking for Humphrey, with a regular gig at the Queen's Arms Hotel. Ewan released a number of solo albums in the coming years and a record with Looking for Humphrey. Ewan's mother passed away from cancer in 1989, and this had a profound impact on him. Everything changed not long after this, and my parents separated. Ewan moved up the coast to Umarella, the Tainch property on Lake Wyber. The next move took Ewan to what would become one of his very special places. This place, Newfarm. Core of my heart, Newfarm. I loved coming to spend my few nights a week with Ewan and Christy in Newfarm. They were exciting times for me as a teenager. Christy worked at the cinema and we'd see 3 movies a week. We were really into film. One of my first loves. When I was 15, Ewan introduced me to jazz, and he'd take me on a Tuesday night, I think it was, to see the Trevor Hart Quartet down at Rick's Cafe in the Valley. He introduced me to so much: music, books, film, and of course, red wine. My mother would take me to see him play at the Travelodge with the Ewan MacKenzie Blues Project when I was 13 or 14, and later I would go on my own to see him play with Credo at the Healer. This was fantastic. I was 17, I'd meet up with Tim Buckley, Gary Buckley's son, and every Friday night, and we'd then go off and explore all the clubs. I left for the UK in 99, and I think I was as much worried about him as he was about me during this time. He was going through a rough patch. He'd tell me of wild nights out with Kevin Purton, watching the rugby and drinking copious amounts of Guinness. It was on one of these nights out when he mentioned meeting a lovely redhead, whom he'd actually met years before. This lovely redhead was Alison Kay, the woman who would become his third wife. Alison and Ewan had a great place in Bramston Terrace, a really happy place and time. Music, sing-along nights and folkies like Rose, John, Mary, Reese, Michael and Erna, and Alan Mackey reappears. I'd go over every Tuesday or Wednesday night for dinner and a night of great TV. But these nights would usually pretty much always end up being all-nighters of drinking red wine, talking and listening and playing music, and I'd head off to work really hungover. There were also the Thursday nights at the Mad Ass Folk Club at South Leagues Club, and then Broadway Hotel, and then the Muddy Farmer. Alison and Ewan were regulars at the Woodford Folk Festival around this time. It was about 2002 or 2003 when the Tony Gatliff film Swing came out. Ewan became obsessed with Django and Manouche music. He'd always loved Django's playing, and he was an early influence, but this film reignited that passion. That was such an exciting time to witness and to be around. Musicians were coming over to Alison and Ewan's for Manouche jams. Ewan formed a friendship with Manouche guitarist Michelle Trebelsi and played the New Caledonia Manouche Festival. Ewan and Alison travelled to Holland for Ewan's masterclasses with Lolo Mir and to Samoa Festival in France. It all clicked for Ewan after this, acoustic music and jazz, and the first Oz Manouche kicked off in 2006. In the late 2000s, Ewan returned to Newfarm, living in a flat under Karen and Paul's place in Villiers Street. The back veranda was a place of much, much music. Rehearsals, jams from folk, Manouche, blues, anything. I spent many a great night hanging out with Ewan, Karen, Paul and whoever else happened to drop in. It was here that Ewan and I rehearsed our material for a gig we did at Newham Creek in 2011. Around this time, Ewan was playing with Kay Sullivan in Paris Dreaming. But it was next door, probably about 5 years ago, when I was having a drink with Ewan before he was going to head off to a gig. And Ewan told me about this beautiful, intelligent woman he was falling for. Her name is Lisetta. He called her that day, and that was the first time Lisetta and I spoke. He ended up moving up there with Lisetta up on Mount Nebo, a place that would become one of his spiritual homes. Lisetta and Ewan had a wonderful trip to Paris that was so significant to both of them. And in June last year, and a few months back in the hospital, he told me that he was planning to marry her. I was so happy for them. The last time Ewan and I spoke, he told me with tears streaming down his face how much he loved her. That last time I spoke to Ewan, it was a goodbye. He reached out to hold my hand and said, "Will you be okay without me?" I said I would, but that I would miss him so much every day. He said, "Just make sure you live life with passion and try to be happy. As he did, I will endeavour to do so."
Thank you, Megan. It was a wonderful speech. Very courageous and full of great stuff. Wonderful.